And so the story continues. A little while ago, I went and decided I would collect some headlines about business from around the world. And let me just share with you those headlines. 21 workers die in fire at H&M factory. Bitter plight of vanilla trade children. Blackwater fallout. Senate moves to rein in military contractors. Connecticut sues bank, investment firm, and Madoff losses. Tracing the bitter truth of chocolate and child labor. Microsoft bosses told child slavery must end. Sochi Olympic workers unpaid for months. Lawsuit over contamination in fish oil supplement. Coca-Cola hit by pollution claim in India. Tobacco candy could poison kids. Time to clean up. UN study reveals environmental cost of world trade. Chemical firm Innospec admits bribing foreign officials. Minamata disease victims approve settlement. Awareness rises, but women still lag in pay. Uganda environment body worried by Tulo's safeguards. French rail SNCF sorry for racist alert for Romanians. Coal fuels much of internet cloud, says Greenpeace. Toxic towns, people of Mossville are like an experiment. AIG settles U.S. claims of black mortgage fee bias. Massive Jatropha farming threatens food security. UK stops vulture funds picking on poor. Goldman Sachs messages show it thrived as economy fell. Toyota accused of withholding crash lawsuit data. Coca-Cola sued in U.S. by Guatemalans over anti-union violence. An Amazon dam project pits economic benefit against protection of indigenous lands. Tesoro refinery blast kills 5. 25 miners killed in West Virginia explosion. Giant Ethiopian dam to make 200,000 go hungry. New scrutiny on censorship issues for U.S. companies in China. Chiquita faces new claims over Colombia terrorism. Forced labor exposed at China kiln. Violence and abuse rife in food factories. I collected those headlines from one 3-month period. I didn't particularly try to pick a particularly bad 3-month period. I probably could go back and collect a similar set of headlines over the last 3 months. But in light of how wonderful the Garden of Eden was really designed to be, we have to ask, what went wrong? How did things end up so badly? And the answer to that, of course, is the second movement of the grand narrative, the movement we call the fall. And the fall itself is actually described in actually just a few short verses in chapter 3 of Genesis, and let me read it to you. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it, or you will die." "You will not surely die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. And the consequences of the fall were immediate. Everything was broken. The human-God relationship was broken. Before the fall, God would come and walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the garden. But now when God shows up, they run and hide. Before the fall, Adam and Eve were totally comfortable with each other, but now they see each other as naked and they run to try to hide from each other. Before the fall, the relationship between humanity and creation was in this wonderful, harmonious balance. But now at the curse, the ground is cursed, and thorns and thistles grow up. Even work, which was designed to be such a wonderful expression of aspects of their identity, now becomes hard and stressful. It's only by the sweat of the brow that they're going to be able to earn their food that they need to live. And of course, these distortions continue to today. In every dimension, business has been distorted as a result of the fall. The relationship between human and God shows up in this deep lack of meaning and quest for identity through work. The relationship between humans that is distorted shows up in a whole host of different ways in business. It shows up in unjust labor practices and exploitive advertising and sweatshops and unsafe working conditions and office politics and racism and sexism and a whole host of ways in which people don't treat each other well, all again a result of the fall. There is disruption between humanity and the environment. The water tables are falling, temperatures are rising, and of course even the nature of work itself remains distorted. It's interesting to think about in this sense that work is for everyone now viewed as a disutility. From management or employer standpoint, if I can get the job done with less labor, the better, because labor is a cost to me. And from an employee standpoint, if I can get a job that will pay me just as much and give me more time off on vacation, all the better, because labor is a cost to me. Over and over, labor is viewed as something to be gotten away from rather than to be embraced. And the nature of labor has changed. Our work today is frequently in a 24/7 kind of environment, a far cry from that natural rhythm of rest and work that was built into the design of the garden. Everything is broken. Now, if you think about what was really at stake with Adam and Eve in the garden, one way to describe the nature of the temptation that was posed to them was, would they be willing to continue to live as limited creatures, or would they instead insist, in the words of the serpent, in being like God, that is, without limits? You see, God is without limits. We can never describe God from the outside. We can never put boundaries around God. Anytime we try to put God in a box, we always discover that He's bigger than any box we can create. But Adam and Eve were specifically designed to be limited creatures. In fact, it's interesting that this tree that they were forbidden to touch and eat from was at the very middle of the garden, the very middle of their identity. It was central to their identity. In some ways, it comes to reflect a whole set of balances that has been built in, a set of limits and balances built into the very fabric of the garden itself. There's an Old Testament word, Shalom. That word is actually not used in Genesis 1 and 2. It shows up a little later in Genesis, but it's really a good description for the condition of the garden. Shalom is, when we see that word in Hebrew, we typically translate it as peace. But that's a pretty thin translation, because for most of us, peace tends to mean something like an absence of conflict. It's more of a negative word. But shalom here is a very positive word. It's the kind of peace that comes when everything is in its right place, when there's this dynamic but harmonious balance, when there's this long-term sustainable things all held together, and it's got embedded in it this sort of sense of limits. So when Adam and Eve violate the central limit of the garden, what breaks is shalom, and it breaks everywhere. Now, what does this have to say about business? Well, if you and I want to run business that looks more and more the way God originally designed, that pushes back toward shalom, it seems to me we need to be willing to reintroduce and respect limits. Limits that perhaps never needed to be articulated in the initial balance and harmony of the garden, but now are needed because of the fall. Now, this whole notion of limits is really critical to understanding how God thinks about business. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine that business is like this mighty river, and it's racing down the hill. Now, the direction, where it's going to, its ultimate destination, is like what we've been talking about, the purpose. It's what it's aiming for. It's the sea, and it's important that we get the sea, the purpose, correct. But this river has got a huge volume of water in it. And even as it's racing toward a correct destination, unless there are some levees alongside the banks, it's going to spill out of its channel and do harm to the surrounding countryside. And so when we're talking about limits, we're really talking about these levees, these in a sense, boundary conditions that business needs to respect if it's not going to do harm, even when it is pursuing an appropriate purpose. Let me give you another example of limits. Imagine a football game. Imagine that you know nothing about football, and I'm going to invite you over to watch a football game with me. And you come over and you say, look, it's going to be boring. I don't understand what I'm watching. And imagine that before the game starts, I explain to you the object. The object is to get more points than the other team. And you do that by moving this funny shaped ball down the field or kicking it between the sticks. Surely then, if you were watching the game, you would have a better feel for it. You would know what each of the teams were trying to accomplish. But still, there'd be lots you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know, for example, why after 3 tries, one team always kicks the ball to the other team. It's a question actually we ask a lot in Seattle. But it's, you wouldn't understand. You wouldn't understand why somebody running down the sidelines isn't tripped by people that are standing over there, or why the defense doesn't jump on the quarterback before the ball is hiked, because that would seem like even better defense. In a sense, what you wouldn't understand is the rules. But imagine that you came and before the game started, all I explained to you were the rules. You'd have a better understanding why there were just 11 people on the field and why the offensive guys didn't grab the defensive guys by their face mask and those kinds of things. But if you didn't know what they were trying to accomplish, you'd still kind of be lost. It's only when you would understand the object and the rules, when you understand the purpose and the limits, that you have a full sense of football, or by analogy, a full sense of what God intends for business. And so we have to talk about limits and what limits business should be respecting. Now, while I'm not sure that this one word fully captures it, it does seem to me that it gets a lot of it, and we ought to maybe start here. And we ought to think about limits as involving this notion of sustainability. There are actually hints of sustainability embedded in the garden story, the Genesis 1 and 2 story. Many of you may not know, but Adam and Eve were actually vegetarians. God gave them every seed-bearing fruit to eat. And one way to understand that is to recognize that God was allowing them to have what they need to sustain themselves, but in a way that would not destroy the underlying productive capacity of the ground. In Genesis 1, Adam and Eve were told to rule over and have dominion. It was a strong, tough word. They were in charge. But in Genesis 2, they were told to use their authority in a way that would protect or guard or sustain the garden. The notion was that they were to preserve this garden over the long haul. And so even from the beginning, notions of sustainability were built into this picture. And perhaps in business today, what we need to do is to reinstate limitations of sustainability. So the question is really, what do we mean by sustainability? John Wesley has written what he's called General Rules for Moral Living. And he has 2 sort of broad introductory rules. One is do good. And that's kind of like our earlier statement about purpose. Serve in these key ways. Do good. But the second of his 2 introductory principles is do no harm. And that might be actually a good way to think about sustainability. That is, it's kind of a Hippocratic oath for business. That is, as business pursues its legitimate purposes, it should do so in a way that does not do any long-term harm. Now, often when we talk about sustainability in the United States, we're really meaning environmental sustainability, and clearly that's a piece of it. But in this context, what I mean is much broader. What I mean is sustainable or doing no harm across all of the different constituencies of a business. All of its stakeholders. That would be shareholders and employees and customers and vendors, as well as the environment and the broader community. And so what would it mean for business to pursue its legitimate objectives, but in a way that does no harm to its stakeholders? Well, here's a couple examples. As it relates to shareholders, what it means is I can't take a shareholder's capital and use it up without paying a risk-adjusted, reasonable rate of return, because that's not sustainable. Similarly, as it relates to employees, I cannot hire someone and pay them less than a livable wage. Why? Because if I use up their entire productive capacity and yet do not give them enough to live on, that's not sustainable. That's why, by the way, I think Christians should be at the front edge of the living wage movement in this country. Similarly, if I, vis-a-vis customers, bombard them with advertising that is designed to cultivate in them a persistent hunger that can never be satisfied, that's not sustainable. And so as we think about how we should be doing business in light of these first 2 movements of the grand narrative, we should be pursuing service subject to these boundary conditions. Or to maybe be stated a little bit more completely, business exists to provide opportunities for individuals to express aspects of their God-given identity in meaningful and creative work, and to provide goods and services that will enable the community to flourish. But as business pursues those purposes, it must do so bounded by, considering options that are limited by, notions of sustainability across all of the dimensions of the business.